There is one movement that people with back injuries, such as bulging or herniated discs, do more than any other that prevents their back from getting better. It's a movement that often reproduces the very direction that they were going in when they bent down to put their sock on and their back went. Yet it's always recommended, whether you're going to your GP, your doctor, or your physical therapist. Today, we're going to unpack the forward bending, the spinal flexion that is used in so many different exercises as a relief strategy to help you with your lower back pain, and explain why we have such success when you remove this particular movement from all of your back pain rehab. If you're new here, I'm Michael, the lead osteopath and spine specialist here at Back in Shape. We help people around the UK and all over the world fix their back pain from home and get back in shape for the long term. And if there is one thing that more or less everybody is doing before they join the program, no matter who they've seen, it is these forward bending movements. And today you're going to understand once and for all why we need to get rid of them. What better place to start than why you might have been recommended them in the first place? Exercises like knee hugs, child's pose, sciatic flossing, or simply just curling up in a ball to alleviate the pain are movements that are all too often recommended for you guys when you first injure your lower back. The main way these stretches actually work to provide you with some relief comes down to the anatomy of the spine. And the spine is very different. When we have injuries to the spine, we have these finite bony canals, these spinal canals. We have really three. We have the central canal, which is the one that the spinal cord runs through up here. And then on either side, we have two little exit foramina here and on the other side as well, where those spinal nerves go out. And when we do these exercises, all we are doing is taking that hole and making it larger. Now, if we consider the two things that all of you with back pain are going to have, whether it's just back pain or whether there's an element of sciatica as well, is that number one, you've got an injury there. Maybe we've got a disc bulge like so, and it is bulging into that spinal space, therefore making it smaller. That could be the first thing. We could also have some degree of degenerative change. We could have things like ligamentum flavum hypertrophy if we've had it for a long period of time. We could have other quirks, such as in the case of spondylolisthesis, which change the size and shape of this hole. Secondarily, we have an inflammatory process. There is an injury there, make no mistake. And inflammation is being driven to this area of the spine where the injury is. What's the consequence? Congestion. So short of that initial instant where you bent over to pick the sock up or to put your shoes on and your back went, much of the residual aggravation you're getting from one moment to the next is the fact that there is this congestion in that area, both of the tissue that might be bulging in the case of the bulging or herniated disc, but also of the inflammation reaction that's taking place in that area of the back. And make no mistake, inflammation is good. It's the way in which we heal. It's a natural process to bring resources to the area and get rid of waste products. But in the lower back, we have this quirk of limited space, and that's where complications can arise. And the reason these exercises feel so good is that when you do that gross forward bending, you hug your knees, you're simply making that hole larger and creating more space, easing the pressure, the irritation on the nerves and other tissues, and it feels nice. Problem is that all of this comes at a cost. And firstly, we have to acknowledge that injury. We have the disc material bulging backwards towards the spinal canal or the exit foramina, which means that the annulus fibrosus, the ligaments of the disc on this section here, are damaged. They are strained. It also means inevitably there'll be some element of damage to the other mesh of ligaments in between the spinal segment, creating instability. These tissues have been damaged going forwards in that direction there, bending over. And by repeatedly bending them over, as those tissues are trying to knit back together and restore some element of spine stability, we are constantly repeating the very movement that has caused the problem in the pursuit of simply reducing the congestion in this area by making the hole larger. You can see how this is just the same as if you've stung yourself with stinging nettles and you keep on scratching. It feels relieving in the moment, but all you're doing is ripping off the surface layers of the skin, pushing those barbs from the nettles deeper and deeper, making the problem worse. It's important to note, our spine is under load every single day compared to other joints such as our knees, hips, our shoulders, our wrists and elbows. We can take those off relative strain reasonably effectively, but with our backs we can't do that. And so the structures that have been injured are already under more strain every single day. And by focusing forward bending into those segments, compared to the axial load bearing, the compressive load bearing in a neutral position, we are putting vastly more strain on the tissues on the back part of the spine, which includes these ligament layers of the annulus fibrosus on the back here as well, as we squash down on the front here and create a impetus for the disc material to further drive backwards into those weakened and what are trying to recover layers of the annulus fibrosus. And it is not that you're causing a gross irritation or worsening of the problem, but it is that you are doing these every single day, often multiple times a day, serving to constantly aggravate, pick at the corners of the scab that is trying to form in that lower back and restore integrity. We have to also remember that these ligaments have a relatively poor blood supply, and so remodeling, healing takes place at a much slower rate than other tissues of the body. And so if we are constantly picking at the scab, the scar tissue formation, the healing, interrupting that, we're setting ourselves up for moving 2 steps forwards and 3 steps back, 2 steps forwards and 3 steps back. The next issue is relatively unique to the spine, and that is that you do not control how these joints move. Just like the example of the flexible light, the reading light, we grab one end of the light and we pull it, and all the individual joints of that light will equally bend and move to our will because there is a natural healthy tension that holds that light in its alignment wherever you leave it. And so too is the spine. These bones, although they look nice and steady in this position here, they are held in their position, not by the muscles, but by the ligament tension from one segment to the next. And then the muscles act on that tension to create movement, moving it in one direction or another. This is fundamentally no different to any other joint in our body. The reason our finger doesn't spontaneously dislocate is because there are tension around the ligaments, and then the muscles then can act on those structures. The reason why when we relax and fall asleep, we don't dislocate all of our joints is because there is a natural passive tension throughout the entirety of our skeleton between all of those joints, provided by the ligaments. And when we injure the integrity of any joint, specifically the spine in this case, we have injured the integrity of those segments. And therefore they now, like in the example of the light, are a weak link in the chain. They will be the ones that move first. When we're doing large movements like the knee hug to completely flatten the lumbar spine, we will see that the segment, maybe L4, L5 or L5S1, that is injured is going to be the path of least resistance for that movement to move through. And so the very injured structure is not only getting that high amplitude full forward bend, but it's also getting more of the gross movement that should be going through all of the lumbar spine, because that's the path of least resistance for the movement to go through. And while there are some quirks, for example, in the case of extreme bracing provided by the small paraspinal muscles, involuntary contractions of these muscles, that's only going to serve to create asymmetrical strain in other areas of the spine. Think about the battle ropes in the gym. As you flick the rope, a nice little wave runs along the rope. And now imagine you put a length of pipe, maybe a foot-long length of pipe, along that rope, and you flicked it again. In the case of the bracing situation, at either end of that piece of pipe that's on the rope, as you're constantly flicking it, doing these knee hugs, you're going to create excessive wear on the rope, where the pipe, the stiffness of the pipe, starts to meet the flexibility of the rope. And so there are other disadvantages that can occur in the case of the individual that has extreme spinal bracing around these segments. And both of those are going to be got around by just avoiding these spinal flexion movements. That particular topic is something that we can certainly unpack in another video in way more detail. The important takeaway at this point is that when we have this instability at a level of the lumbar spine, such as the L5S1 segment, when we're doing large ranges of motion movements, we are going to find that movement will preferentially, generally, go through that particular segment, creating aggravation and interrupting that healing and stabilization process that's trying to take place. And because, unlike so many of the other joints, we don't have an ability to segmentally, consciously control a section of the spine, the best thing we can do in this part is provide a region-specific stability, which we're going to get onto a little bit later. The third criticism of exercises that continually push extreme levels of spinal flexion are that it has no long-term purpose, number one. And number two, it does absolutely nothing that other more conservative approaches can't meet the need of. For example, we can do spinal decompression work using the bed decompression or towel decompression exercises to take pressure off and enlarge some of the spaces in a more subtle way. We can use walking within pain-free tolerances to manage the excess congestion in the lumbar spine. The decompression can do that as well, especially with the bed decompression strategy, where we can create pumping. We can also use things like contrast bathing to help manage the circulation to that area of the lower back and manage those excessive levels of inflammation in the lower back. These three things have no extreme ranges of motion, no spinal flexion, no spinal forward bending, putting those tissues under extreme and unnecessary levels of strain, whilst providing the very thing that one could perceive forward bending is providing, and that is a way of managing the congestion in that region of the lumbar spine. So you have all of the benefits with none of the downsides of these other options. And guess what? They're also free as well. You can do them at home for completely free at no charge. Ultimately, these flexion-based exercises, the knee hugs, the child's pose, and others like that, offer no long-term strategy. How do you know you've done enough? Where is it going? And I think we close today's episode of the podcast by giving you a much more clear example. And I would encourage any of you guys, no matter who is helping you with your back pain, to speak to the individual. Tell them to tell you precisely how what they are doing is making your back better, and how it's being managed, how it's being monitored, and how can we measure this element of progress over the course of time. What is the mechanism of action behind what we're doing, whether it's what you're doing at home or what you're doing in the clinic, so you can understand, if they understand, what they're recommending you. So the squat is one of the exercises that we really use as a foundational one to build or rebuild back integrity and stability. And I thought I'd walk you through just how this works so you can see the difference between a futile exercise that is only serving to make the problem worse and something that actually can work and how it works within you. And it's very, very simple. When we first learn to perform the squat, we are learning to coordinate a degree of spinal control and stability to the spinal segment. And we are finding, of course, a pain-free range. This should not be aggravating ourselves. And when we're doing this, the spine should not bend one way or another. It should be maintaining a neutral position. This benefits us in the early days because it allows us to first have an appreciation for maybe just how bad we are at controlling our body, our own body, and maybe make us realize why those flare-ups that are happening on a daily basis or weekly basis then may have felt like they were for no reason, but actually we can see just how many times we get up every day, how many times we're doing a squat, and how badly we're doing it. It's an eye-opener at the very least, which can be very good in many ways. And we're learning in these first instances, as the days and maybe even week goes on, you are getting more and more competent at recruiting the midsection musculature, not just the core, alongside the hips to coordinate a movement that does not strain your back on a daily basis, which makes the movements of daily life safer immediately from day one. Because the amount of times you're getting up and down out of some chair, the dining table, the toilet, the car, the sofa, your bed every morning, those movements are going to be gradually and relatively quickly more safe because you're more capable of controlling your own back. Ergo, you stop aggravating those injuries down in the lumbar spine and allow that natural automatic process of healing to start to gather some momentum. In the medium term, you are building up the strength of those exact same muscles to start to condition them better, so they are more resilient, more capable of preventing your spine from moving off in one direction or another, and therefore placing excessive strain on a section of the lumbar spine that is injured and trying to recover. You're still doing this within pain-free ranges. You're not aggravating the lower back, and your choreography is there maintaining a neutral spine, no pelvic tilts, tucks, butt winks, folding forwards, or any of that. Just a good quality, competent squatting motion. And just one caveat, this exercise can be started out even with the assistance holding onto the hands of your other half or holding onto a door frame to make it accessible to absolutely every human being, no matter how bad their back injury is or how much pain they're in. So now in this mid stage, we have built greater resilience, a greater buttress against the strains of daily life. And we're probably going back out into the real world and doing more things as well, testing ourselves, but having that greater strength and capacity within our own muscles to protect that spine as it continues to become a little bit more healed, a little bit more resilient, and a little bit more stable. The final part is the long term. And that is that you have started or continued to add a load being applied perpendicular to the discs to challenge them in a safe way, progressively over the weeks and months, to make objective, clear improvement in the capacity of your disc that was injured and couldn't bear load to bear load. You have numbers, you have evidence, You have a history that you can look back on and say, I know without a shadow of a doubt that I could not lift this 20-kilo weight 6 months ago or 6 weeks ago. And now I can do it without pain for 10 repetitions. That is an objective cue, marker, indication that that disc is more capable of bearing load. You are more capable of controlling it. And that is the definition of properly rehabilitating your lumbar spine. You might not be all the way there just yet, but that is something that has purpose. You can now clearly see how the thing that you're doing every day, in spite of the pain in the early days, it's actually got a pathway to making you better. And you have something concrete that you can point to suggest that those disc bulges or herniations in your lower back at L45 or L5S1 must be stronger than they were before, because you've got the test to prove it. So hopefully that was enlightening, made you think a little bit. And don't feel disheartened if you've been lulled into these sorts of exercises, the knee hugs, the child's pose, the bending, the twisting, all of that kind of stuff. You're in good company, because more or less everybody that's ever joined the program has. But hopefully this gives you a strategy to start to think about how what I'm doing is helping my back get stronger, and having something that you can measure along the way to verify that it's stronger. How can you possibly do that with something like a knee hug or a child's pose or just bending over? Doesn't make any sense. So if you need any more resources to help you guys, we have tons of episodes of the podcast on all things back health. We also have the full masterclass, which is an 80-minute workshop style video that'll help you walk you through some of the principles that we teach in the Back in Shape program. And if you've been struggling for a long period of time and just want to get started, following a structure with support alongside it to help you get your back in shape again, then check out the website backinshapeprogram.com or reach out to us on the various platforms you're watching this.